Hello and welcome to another episode of Decode. I hate you. I hate you because you're black, because you're Muslim, because you're Latino, because you're an immigrant, because you're gay. In a nutshell, I hate you because someone has trained me to hate you. Today in Decode, we're going to talk about the dynamics of manufactured hatred in social media. Due to my job in media, I travel a lot. Only this year, 2025, I have visited India 2 times, I've visited the US several times, also the United Arab Emirates, or even places like Morocco. And every time I travel to one of these countries, I always see the same thing, which is good people, hospitable, kind, curious, the kind of people who offer you a cup of tea, who offer you advice, and who never ask for anything in return. But yet, when we see those same countries many times represented on media or spoken about by our politicians, they are presented to us like enemies, like people we should fear. You should fear the immigrants, you should fear the blacks, the Muslims, and yada, yada, yada. And it's a really strange situation because really, if you think about it, I've been there, so I have experienced those people firsthand, and they are lovely and they're nice. And then at the same time, politicians or journalists who I have never met in my life, those people are the ones telling me that the people I've met are actually evil and that we should not trust them. And that generates this sense of discomfort that someone is trying to manufacture enemies out of people who, in my opinion, are actually lovely. And those people can be, Donald Trump or Vladimir Putin, or here in Spain, Abascal and the political party Vox. So it seems to me like there's a dynamic in recent years of manufacturing hate towards collectives. In this video, I want to talk about this idea of the hate factories. Why do they do it? What are they trying to achieve? And what can we do to counter these dynamics, which I think are very, very dangerous? Because again, they want us to hate the Muslims, they want us to hate the gays, they want us to hate the straight ones, the right-wingers, the left-wingers. Someone is out there always making sure that wherever we go, anywhere we look at, there's always someone to hate. So today in Decode, let's talk about the business of manufacturing enemies. Let's start by talking about who is in charge of all this. Typically, it's either politicians or journalists, which is the people who in general try to generate opinion, be it a politician like Trump or Putin or a journalist in a newspaper. These are people who in general want to influence the way we think, and it seems to me like this is kind of like a business model. If you think about it, a journalist can write about, mainstream stuff like, they found something on Mars, but that's going to not generate that much interest. Or they can see controversy, and controversy sells, and it generates, clicks. And, this clickbait is going to be very efficient. The same way, when you talk about politicians, of course, they want to sell themselves as the saviors, as someone needed for the future of the country. And no better way to present yourself as a savior than to generate a sense of fear. When we're scared of someone or some collective, basically that politician can say, I will save you, and then they're manipulating our opinion. So as you can see, again, there's different collectives that for different reasons they want to manufacture enemies because it's good for their own interests. If we look at some examples, again, Trump has been doing this recently since this second term with immigrants. Putin is doing this against the West in general and also the LGBT community. Here in Europe, we have very right-wing parties, such AfD in Germany or Vox in Spain, doing this against the Muslims. And of course, we have the eternal conflict, for example, between Israel and Palestine with regards to, hating mutually each other. The language changes, every case is a little bit different, and the suit changes and the flag changes, but the trick is always the same. There's someone who is interested in basically getting, recognition, and what he's going to do is that he's going to make you believe that your personal problems, such as, unemployment, frustration, the fear of being left behind, the fear of globalization, that they're not their fault, but it's the fault of someone else, typically someone weaker that we're going to label as the enemy, So it's not that you don't have a job
for any other reason. No, you don't have a job because the immigrants are stealing your job. And this kind of dynamic is what we see. And it's actually a perfect equation if you think about it. What they're doing is they're creating a wicker man, like a facade, and while you're distracted with this wicker man and trying to aim all your hatred towards, the immigrants or the Muslims or whatever collective they choose, they can do whatever they want because they're winning time to actually build their own agenda, which typically is to actually favor those who have put them in power. In this case, for example, Trump is very evident, and also Putin with the case of all the oligarchs in Russia, right? While the population of Russia believes that the West hates them, you have 20, 30 families actually becoming extremely rich with this absurd war in Ukraine, for example. The hatred becomes kind of like a political firewall. It distracts us, it divides us, and it makes us dependent on this leader who has posed himself as the savior by promising you a new identity that many times you don't even know that you had. Imagine this. Imagine, for example, I am left-handed, right? And of course, being left-handed is not so relevant. But someone could come and say, hey, you're left-handed. You are being discriminated by the right-handed guys, and the way you drive cars is designed for right-handed people, and the way you sit in chairs has been designed for right-handed people. You see what I'm doing? What I'm doing is actually creating an identity that I wasn't even aware that I had. And then once you have the identity, of course, everybody who's outside of that identity becomes the enemy. I know this sounds like an absurd example, the example of left-handed versus right-handed. Later, I will show you other examples which seem equally absurd, but they are really, really dangerous, and they're going on in our day and age in this world that we live in. And this trick works because typically what they do is they disguise this dynamics of hatred with patriotism and values and order, right? If you are a good American, you need to follow Trump because, that's what good Americans do. And if you're a good Russian, you need to follow Putin. And if you're a good Spanish, you need to, rally around the right-wing parties, as if the rest of people of Spain or the rest of people in the US or the rest of people in Russia were not, good patriots of their country, right? So what they do is they manufacture fear, and then when they rally you against their tribe, so to say, they sell this identity as some sort of national pride. But that's kind of like the mechanism that they use. So now let's begin talking about the psychology of this fear. It works. These people, the people who manipulate us with this kind of tactics, it's easy to dismiss them as fools. And I've seen that done with Donald Trump, for example, many times, like, oh, he's a clown. He's not a clown. He's extremely smart. And he knows exactly what he's doing. What he's doing, he's exploiting a weakness of the human mind. Think about this. At the end of the day, we're monkeys. We're furless monkeys. We're tribal. And basically, when we're scared, when we're afraid, we don't want to be alone. That's kind of like the basic primal instinct of any human being, right? When we are afraid, we don't want to be alone because being alone is dangerous. It puts us in risk. So when we're scared, what we do is we look for belonging. We look to belong in some sort of a group. And basically, when we're part of the group, we feel like we can be defended by the group. The problem is that, of course, when you create a group, you create an inside and an outside. And typically, when these dynamics of fear are stoked, the definition of this inside or outside is typically very absurd to the point of being really ridiculous. I'm going to give you a first example. As many of you guys have heard in the last weeks, it was just announced that Bad Bunny, the famous singer, is going to be performing at the Super Bowl, at the halftime show of the Super Bowl, which I believe is February next year. And it's interesting the way Trump and his team reacted to this. And so when it was announced that Bad Bunny was going to perform, first thing Trump said is, I have never heard of him, which is kind of funny, and actually Kristi Noem, who is actually one of the teammates of Trump, especially with regards to immigration and homeless security, basically she began announcing raids at the Super Bowl to detect immigrants and get them away from the country. Sure, that could be a good idea if Bad Bunny was an immigrant, but he's not. Bad Bunny is actually from Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico, as you most of you know perfectly well, is a territory of the US. And so that makes Bad Bunny actually born and raised in the US. The fact that he actually sings in Spanish doesn't make any difference, because there's many other artists from the US who have sung in Spanish in the past. That doesn't undermine the fact that they are citizens of the US. So again, that's what I was trying to explain before, that whenever you begin building like a cohort of your guys and then defining who is the enemy, of course it's very easy to fall in the absurd and basically putting Bad Bunny outside of the group, when actually Bad Bunny, here's the irony, he's more American than the wives of the president and the vice president of the US. Because if you look at the families of the two biggest men in the US, the wife of Donald Trump is actually Melania Trump, who was born in East Europe, and the wife of J.D. Vance is actually of Indian origin. So these two people are giving lessons to Bad Bunny about what it is to be from the US, which, it's ridiculous if it wasn't a little bit scary. But again, this is the way they do it. They appeal to our tribalism, our sense of belonging, and this sense of belonging was etched into our brain long before you and me were born. That has been in our ape brain for millennia. We fear to lose what we have. It's our job, our language, our neighborhood, our safety. Let's look at some examples. When there was the campaign for this term, Donald Trump, repeated that sentence about people from Haiti of they're eating the dogs, they're eating the cats. You see, he was appealing at this primal fear of safety. With Bad Bunny again, he's going to speak in a different language because he's going to be speaking in Spanish. Again, language. So again, there's the different pillars of identity, and typically this factories of hatred, they go to one of these pillars because those are the easy ones to actually generate fear on the audience. Fear activates those brain areas, and those brain areas are actually older than the brain areas that deal with reasoning. It's more about our survival instinct. The idea is that we tend to use mental shortcuts in our brain because of economy of effort. Sometimes we do like deep analysis. For example, if we need to do math, or if we need to do something involved. But some other times we just go with slogans. We go with simple formulas, and this is one of those cases. Fear is a very, very, very simple formula, and our brain, it hates to think too much because, again, of economy of effort, and that's the reason why these hate speeches are so effective, because they fit in a single sentence. It's a simple sentence to remember, and typically it enters your brain because it has been said by someone with high reputation. If the president of the US says something, or if Vladimir Putin says something, of course the citizens of their country were inclined to believe that what they're saying is true, even though maybe it is a lie. And the problem in the last decade or so has been that social networks have amplified that phenomenon kind of like 10 times. If you think about it, a social network cannot guess what you like. What it will do is show you things that you already like. So again, if you hate something, the social network is going to detect that pattern and is going to show you more of the same, more of what you hate, more of what you fear, more of what you doubt about. And that's what's called the echo chamber. The echo chamber is this phenomenon by which people on social networks, they actually become more radical of whatever opinion they had before, just because the social network is going to reinforce that dominant content that we're attracted to. So it's not like the social network will open our minds. It's actually the social network will close our minds. It will make our worldview even more narrow. So again, politicians, journalists, and social networks, they're manipulating us. Not so much because we're stupid, but just because we're human. And as humans, nobody from us is actually vaccinated against fear, because fear is a very, very primal instinct. I'm going to give some examples. To begin with, let's talk about the US, right? The myth of the invasion, right? If you listen to Donald Trump, you would be led to believe that the US is actually undergoing an invasion in the recent years, and that then, of course, immigration needs to be stopped because there's this impending danger, in the recent years, since 2018 to 2020, basically, ICE, the organization, is actually doing campaigns to actually bring immigrants back to their home countries. Problem being that some of these immigrants, they are from a different country, but their sons are actually U.S. citizens. This has resulted that between 2018 and 2020, over 5,400 children have been separated from their parents at the border, according to the ACLU. Many of those children, again, as I said, were U.S. citizens, and again, the excuse is always the same, which is, no, we need to stop them because we're being invaded. Okay, so this is Decode. Decode is the home of the reasoning and the analysis. So let's look at the data. Again, if Trump really can prove that we're being invaded, then maybe there's a reason for these actions, But the data actually says the opposite. Let me share some data for you. According to data, almost 70% of the undocumented immigrants that are living in the U.S. have been living in the country for more than 10 years. Okay, so again, around 70% of the illegal immigrants in the US have been in the US for 10 years or more. What that means is that it's not true that they're arriving in the last 3, 4, 5 years, which would justify this actions by Donald Trump. No, they've been here for a long time. The only thing is, as I said before, is that Trump, because it's interesting to him, is manufacturing this enemy because now this is going to make him win elections and so forth and so on. And the reality is that this 70% of undocumented immigrants that I was talking about, most of them work, most of them pay taxes, and actually they are contributors to the U.S. economy. According to the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, the immigrants of the U.S., they contribute more than 11 billion per year in state and local taxes. And that makes perfect sense. So again, typically, when something like this happens, we need to apply Occam's razor and try to be logical, okay? When you travel to Mexico, when you travel to Argentina, when you travel to Bolivia, do you find people doing nothing? No. You find normal people trying to get a job, trying to make a living because they have kids, they have wives, they have families, and they're trying to push forward in life, right? So those same guys, when they go to the US or any other country, of course, they try to do the same because they're trying to generate wealth and sustainability for their families, right? So this whole idea that, no, the immigrants are here, they're doing nothing, we need to kick them out, is actually not only wrong, but it also defies all the laws of logic, In fact, many heavy industries of the U.S., such as agriculture, hospitality, and construction, rely heavily on immigrants. And those same people from those industries, they have complained to Donald Trump to say, hey, be careful if you take away all these immigrants because our industries are going to crumble without them. And that's part of the reason why Trump had to make public statements saying, no, if immigrants are actually doing a job, we're going to stop these actions. It's actually a very bad idea to get out of the country those who are holding the basic layers of your economy on some strategic sectors, such as, again, manufacturing, agriculture, construction, etc. That if you take those people away from the country, that's not patriotism, that's stupidity, right? Let's go with the second example. Here in Spain, for example, and also across Europe, we have this campaign going on which links immigration and crime as if all immigrants were criminals. Again, it defies all logic. Do you really believe that whenever you go to any other country, those people are all criminals, with a knife in their teeth, coming to your country to rape our wives and kidnap our children? Doesn't make any sense, right? But that's the campaign they're actually waging. Here we have a political party called Vox who is actually repeating that false claim of immigration brings crime, brings crime, But actually, the reality of Spain, again, let's go back to the data because this is Decode and this is what we do. If you look at the data, it's actually the opposite. Let me share some numbers with you. In 2025, so the ongoing year, the conventional crime rate in Spain has been of 40 offenses per 1,000 citizens. Okay, so for every 1,000 citizens, there's been 40 criminal offenses. And you'll say, is that too much or too little? Well, it's the lowest figure in the historical series, since there's records about this. And this is data, by the way, of the Ministry of the Interior. So again, if immigrants are bringing more crime, the logic of that would say then the crime rate should be going higher, and actually it's the other way around. The crime rate is actually going lower. So again, this is another lie. If you want more specific data on this same year, robberies with violence fell by 9.4%, thefts fell by 3.3%, home burglaries, they decreased by 14%. This is all sources by the newspaper Ep8. Okay, so again, in this same time period where crime is actually going down, immigration is going up. So again, where's the logic of this statement of, immigration brings more crime? It doesn't really hold much water once you look at the data, But again, these people, they use this kind of like false statement because we're led to believe whatever we're told. And of course, some people, vote this kind of parties, In fact, in Spain, according to statistics, about 2% of immigrants actually do commit a crime, which makes a lot of sense because, as I was saying before, if you move to another country, most likely you're trying to get a little better living. You're not here just to rob and steal. You're here to try to, secure wealth for your family and a better tomorrow. So to believe that all immigrants are actually criminals is actually ridiculous. Again, about around 2%. And it's a shame because with all these falsehoods, we miss kind of like the deeper analysis of some things that really didn't need to be analyzed. For example, in the case of Spain, what is actually true is that crime among immigrants is actually higher than crime among Spaniards. So again, if you take the Spanish population and you take the immigrant population, the percentage of immigrants who commit a crime is about between 2 and 3 times as high as the percentage of Spanish people who commit a crime. And that's something that's actually overlooked by these political parties, and that's something that actually deserves an analysis. But again, that analysis is very simple. Immigrants typically come from more poor countries. Of course, Warren Buffett doesn't immigrate. The people who immigrate typically are trying to get better, so they come from more poor countries. And of course, because they come from more poor countries, the chances of one of them actually falling into the hands of crime are actually higher than with Spanish people who now enjoy a better standard of living, if you see what I mean, right? But again, this statement of, immigration brings crime in Spain, it's not actually true, it's actually the opposite, And it's interesting because if you look at Spain, as I said, 2% of the immigrants actually commit a crime, but we need the other 98%, because Spain, as many countries in Europe, has negative birth rates, and so that means that basically we need immigrants to actually keep the population stable, and that those immigrants, of course, sure, 98% are going to be perfectly fine people who are going to contribute to our economy and to our future, Now we can move east and we can talk about Russia. In the case of Russia, I did a couple of videos about Vladimir Putin. You can check them out here. They were quite successful analyzing the psychology of Putin. And this idea that's very Putin-esque, which is the idea of the internal enemy. Putin, because he's the savior of the country, he's the czar of Russia, he needs to always be fighting someone, be it external, like Ukraine, or be it internal, such as the LGBT community, as I wanted to talk about now. His main enemy is the LGBTs. Since 2013, there's a law that bans so-called gay propaganda, whatever that may mean, And actually, in 2022, Putin expanded that law, banning any sort of public expression of a sexual identity which is different from heterosexuality. I have friends in Russia, even holding hands as a homosexual couple is banned and could get you in prison. So again, the situation is quite extreme. Human Rights Watch has documented hundreds of detentions and coordinated harassment campaigns as if, the LGBT community was actually a virus. But again, let's go back to the data. Let's go back to the reality of things. When it comes to gender and identity, there's always a question I have asked myself, which is, what do you care what other people do with their lives? Again, if someone is gay or someone is trans or someone needs to be, fluid, or someone wants to be, any sort of identity, does it affect you at all? Then why bother? That's the thing, right? They're manufacturing an enemy, and it remains to be seen what is the damage that this enemy is doing to you. Again, if someone decides to be gay, how does that affect your life, and why you should worry about that? Not at all, right? But, here's the dynamics of manufacturing of enemies, and how the Russian population, to be good Russians, they have been told you need to hate gay people because, that's our identity. And again, that's the manipulation and the manufacturing of the enemy that I was talking about, And of course, last but not least, we can talk about Israel and Palestine, and I'm going to be really short here because this is an overused subject, But most likely, if you could, I know people who are Muslims, and I've known people from Palestine through my life, and I know people from Israel, and I've met them, several times in my life. And honestly, both of them seem to me very, very fine people. And most likely, a guy from Palestine and a guy from Israel, they're looking for the same stuff, which is a job, which is safety for their families, which is a home, the usual stuff we all care about, Yet, here we are in another war between Israel and Palestine. Now it seems like things are going to get better. Let's, cross our fingers and pray for the best, But again, the attacks of Hamas on October 7th, 2 years ago, if I'm not wrong, were a massacre, absolutely unjustified, and that was savage. And then the response from Israel towards Gaza with tens of thousands dead was also another massacre, absolutely unjustified. But what I want you to do is, let's separate between the Palestinians and the Israelis and their governments. Who started this war? It wasn't the Palestinians, it wasn't the Jews, no. It was Hamas who started. And then who fought back? It wasn't the Jews, it was Netanyahu who actually needed that to stay in power. So you see what I'm trying to say. The idea is that the civilians from both sides most likely could live along easily, but then their leaders are the ones who are living from this conflict, and they're stoking the flames of war with disastrous results that we have seen these last 2 years. The enemy in all of these four cases, the US and Putin and, right wing in Europe, and also Israel and Palestine, the enemy becomes the glue of power, the way to make people easy to control and to make them rally around you as a leader to take them to whatever you want to take them. I'm going to now talk about the tactics of hate. There's 4 tactics and a 5th one, which is especially evil. The first tactic you're going to use to actually generate this enemy is to dehumanize. Basically, you're going to erase the other person's face, his identity as a human, and you're going to begin using words which are words more reserved to animals and to basically disease. So again, you will stop thinking about people, you will stop thinking about immigrants, but you will call them a plague, you will call them invaders, you will call them a mass, a threat. You see this across the media. Whenever one of these politicians or journalists, they want to begin generating hatred, what you're going to do is change the terminology to a terminology that's less human. This is something that takes us back to the dark days of the Nazis in the 1930s and 1940s, and that's what they did with the Jews. Today, any politician who calls a group of refugees an avalanche or something like this is actually using the same techniques on a different scale. Basically, the idea is that when you dehumanize someone, what you're doing is diminishing the amount of empathy we feel for that person or that collective. The second technique you're going to use to generate hatred is to generalize. Basically, what you'll do is cherry pick isolated cases and turn them into labels for millions. Let's say one immigrant commits a crime, for example, a rape. You'll say immigrants are rapists. You see, you're generalizing. Let's say one refugee lies. Oh, all refugees are suspect. It's a mental shortcut, and it works because our brain works in terms of categories instead of individual cases, because again, there's millions of immigrants, but then if we talk about the immigrants, it becomes easier for us to swallow. The populists know it and they exploit it to generate this perception of a bigger threat instead of speaking about the isolated cases. The third trick they're going to use is a trick of fear. This is the most powerful of all of them. The message is simple. If we don't act now, our country is in danger. That's what they're always going to tell you. Again, the perception now in the US for many people is that unless we stop the immigrants, the country is in danger. Which is funny considering that the US is actually a country made by immigrants back in the day, right? So what is the difference between the Irish immigrants that came to the US when they were dying of hunger and now the immigrants who are coming from Latin America? What is the difference? Right? So again, there's this idea of stoking fear, fear of losing jobs, culture, identity, fear of, typically now there's this fear of the future that we don't understand. The world is accelerating, so it's very easy for us to feel overwhelmed by the modern world, and that's a fear that we can use in many, many easy ways. And the fourth trick that these populists are going to use is the trick of normalization. Basically, what we're going to do is start with small things to move to bigger things. We can start with a joke, a joke about gay people. You know what? It's just an innocent joke. But then you repeat the joke, and you repeat it until it slowly stops being a joke, and it just becomes more like a habit, and then it becomes a mainstream political discourse. And along the way, what you're doing is you have desensibilized your population around that type of thinking that began as a joke, but now suddenly you're telling, all gays are evil, and now we should do a law to ban gay people in Russia, as an example. Again, it starts with some innocent joke, but through this process of normalization, before you even realize it, you don't even dare to say anything anymore. Because again, hate, like poison, is administered little by little. We start with the small doses and slowly ramp up. But I said I had five tricks. The fifth trick is actually the most dangerous one, and we're seeing it very, very frequently in these recent years. And that's the one I want you guys to be more aware of, because it is extremely dangerous. It's a trick of the self-fulfilling prophecy. Basically, the idea is that when you want someone to react to a threat, the threat is not really going to exist. So what you need to do is you need to provoke that threat yourself. And so when that threat actually erupts, you present yourself as a savior to the threat that you yourself have been stoking before. For example, typically what you need to do is a cycle of provocation and then response. For example, recently we've seen Trump use this very well in the US in immigration context by talking about certain cities like, we're gonna descend on Portland, we're gonna descend on Chicago. What is he doing when he says that? He's provoking that the left-wing guys, who are the opposite of Trump, actually erupt in those cities, and then he'll come there with police and the National Guard and yada, 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 to say, you see, I was needed, because look at all this turmoil that actually happened because he was the one stoking the fire to begin with. See the idea? So the self-fulfilling prophecy is this idea that whenever you want someone to react, the first thing you do is you provoke them, then they react, then you come as a savior saying, you see, you need me. In a way, this reminds me of the law of physics by Newton that says that any force applied in a direction, it will generate an equal force in the opposite direction, right? So action and reaction. So basically, these messengers of hatred, what they do is very rapidly they provoke, and then when the other party responds, they emerge as the savior of a problem that they themselves have generated to begin with. So now that we have understood the techniques they use to actually stoke this hatred, I want to talk a little bit about why they do it. What are they seeking? Okay, so we live in the 2025, and basically in the last 40 years, the world has become globalized. We have 8 billion people, and the network of alliances and dependencies among countries and among collectives are extremely complex. What that means is that actually any form of cooperation is going to be very, very complicated, because to cooperate, you actually need everybody to kind of like row in the same direction. If you look at the UN, for example, or you look at the EU, or you look at NATO, this kind of organizations, they have a really hard time actually getting everybody to actually act in the same direction, because the world has become way more complicated. This is all about game theory. In game theory, cooperation is always more complicated than competition, because to compete, you can ignore all the other actors in the system and just do your own thing, and that's what Trump is doing. For example, Trump, when he says make America great again, basically he's saying, I don't care about the other countries, I'm going to do my own thing. And nothing wrong with that, but what I'm trying to say is that this kind of leaders like Putin, like Trump, like the right-wing parties in Europe, that's very typical of this generation, of this age, because we live in the age of globalization. And the age of globalization, you can do two things. Either you can try to reach global agreements, and that's going to be very complicated because of the world and because of the complexity of the world, or you do a shortcut and you say, no, I'm going to do my own thing, and then I'm going to reap short-term wins. For example, sure, Trump will reap some short-term wins for the US by ignoring everybody else, but by doing that, he's going to win a lot of enemies abroad, because he's going to be cutting a lot of alliances that the US had up until very, very recently. Again, hatred and manufacturing enemies will always give us short-term benefits to these messengers of hate, because it's actually quite easy to manufacture enemies, because it's much easier to manufacture those enemies than to try to get along with everybody. For example, for Trump to try to get along with the EU, with India, with China, with Latin America, with Africa, it's a really complicated system. Whereas if he says, make America great again, it's much simpler, you see? So the problem with this, of course, is that the cost will only become visible in the long term. If you ignore everybody else and you just go for competition and you manufacture enemies, sure, in the short term, maybe you will reap some benefits, but in the long term, the spillover of this era will be noticed by the next generations, when we realize that basically all the mutual dependencies between countries have been destroyed by these dynamics of enemies. But it's interesting, because actually this has not always been the case. For example, again, as I said before, I work in media, and 2 weeks ago I was actually in Delhi in India, and I was visiting the place of the martyrdom of Mahatma Gandhi. And it's interesting to see how in a country like India, which at that time had 400 million population, which is a lot of people, now India is 1.4 billion, actually Gandhi was able to rally the whole country with one single ideal, which is actually to break free from the British rule in the 1940s, and it's interesting to see how a very diverse community, because in India you have Hindus, you have Buddhists, you have Muslims, you have Jains, you have Zoroastrians, you have Sikhs. So again, there's a myriad of religions, and Gandhi was able to rally all of them together towards a common goal. So again, this idea of trying to cooperate is actually possible and has very good benefits in the past. And it's actually ironic to notice how once the British actually retreated from India and gave India independence, the forces of competition were there right away. And actually, it was one Hindu nationalist who actually murdered Gandhi because of his position with regards to the partition of India between India and Pakistan. So this is a very, very good example of how important it is to cooperate, but also how fragile are the forces of cooperation. Because to unite, it's actually very hard and it's worth it. But our common instinct is to go for the easy solutions, which is actually to compete. So again, I would love to counter, the advice of Gandhi with the current reality of our day and age. I think we're living on dark times when it comes to cooperation. We live in a very selfish era. But actually, if you look at it, the world is undergoing a process of globalization, and that globalization is actually unstoppable. So we only have two ways to go, which is to believe that everybody else is an enemy, and so we will end up hating, the left-handed, the right-handed, the Latinos, the Muslims, the gays, the straights, all different collectives, and this will end very badly for all of us. And if we look back at the 20th century, we can see what are the results of when the world goes crazy. World War I and World War II. So either we follow that route, and that's going to end up in a big disaster, or we all press the brakes and we learn to basically look at each other with respect, with empathy, and understand that all these messengers of hatred that are actually swimming around, flying around us like vultures, we need to be very, very afraid of them, and we need to get them out of our political systems, because they are actually dangerous. The 21st century is not about locking yourself in your small tribe. It's about collaboration. It's about working with people who don't think like you, who don't pray like you, who don't love like you, who have another color of skin or another flag. And the irony, again, is that we already know this. We saw in the last century where this kind of dynamics actually took us, and that's why, for example, we wrote in the middle of last century the Declaration of the Human Rights that now seems long forgotten in the current climate of the international politics. It was an agreement that stated the obvious and revolutionary at the same time, which is that all humans are born free and equal in dignity and rights, without distinction of race, religion, sex, language, or status. And that was a promise, that we would respect each other in order to build a better world together. To unite, not by color of skin or faith or blood or by flag, but about the willingness of living together and finding a better tomorrow. We're facing challenges in this century that need all of us to work together. The challenge of climate change, the challenge of distribution of wealth, the challenge of resources, the challenges posed by artificial intelligence, the challenge to find a better democracy. All of this is going to require global cooperation. And yet, here they are, all of these people that belong to this generation where they keep manufacturing enemies. The history is pushing forward, and these people are actually trying to push us back. So after all this, the question is actually inevitable. What can we ordinary citizens do to avoid being dragged into manipulation and hate? No grand gestures are needed. It's just 5 simple things that I'm going to repeat now that if we apply them, the climate of the world would definitely change. First, we need to learn to verify before sharing. Not everything that circulates, especially on social media, is true. Every time you see something, remember the sentence of Bertrand Russell, the philosopher, let your opinion be based on facts and facts only. A lie shared 1,000 times becomes seeming true. And that's something very dangerous that we need to fight in this day and age. Second, humanize. Behind every statistic, there are people. The Jews are people, the Palestinians are people, the immigrants are people, you and me are people. And of course, each one of us deserves respect and deserves empathy. When we lose our respect, when we lose our empathy, we are actually on a downward spiral of hatred. Third, we need to learn to confront things in a calm manner. Hate cannot be fought with even more hate because then it becomes a spiral. When you hear a racist, a homophobic, or a dehumanizing comment, don't shout, just ask, plant doubt, and ask the person, where did you get that? Where are the facts? Are you sure about it? Because in a calm conversation, we can disarm the other person without turning him into an enemy. Fourth, demand real policies. Politics is not about flags, it's about real problems that you and me are facing on a daily basis. Problems such as jobs, housing, healthcare, education. When a politician will offer you a culprit instead of a solution, begin being suspicious. That person is trying to manipulate you, he's trying to generate a dynamic of enemy. And last but not least, number 5, practice diversity. Try to get out of your bubble. Don't belong to an echo chamber. If you can, travel. If you cannot travel, at least try to make friends with people who come from very different paths of lives, different religions, different sexual orientations, different belief systems, so that you can begin to understand each other and build bridges instead of burning them. Remember this, diversity is never a threat, it's training for the future, and the sooner we understand this, the better we will do as a species. Learn to identify your real enemy. They want us hating each other, but the enemy is not the immigrant, the enemy is not the Muslim, not the gay person, not the Palestinian. The real enemy is that person who's actually behind the desk manufacturing that hatred to remain in power. I have more in common with a Latino, with a Muslim, or with an Indian selling food on the street than with that leader that's actually manipulating us from behind a podium. And so do you. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video. This is Decode. I try to make Decode a channel focused on diversity. Here we analyze, we debate, and sometimes, of course, you will not agree with me, but you know what? That's perfectly okay. Diversity is not thinking the same. It's about being able to disagree with respect and learn from each other. I hope you enjoyed this video. If so, please hit the like button, and if you enjoyed the kind of content that I'm doing, please hit subscribe. We're growing quickly. I'm very, very happy and thankful to all of you guys. As you know, Decode in English is the English version of my original Spanish channel called also Decode, which has over 120,000 followers, and I'm trying to build up that same community here in English as well. If you subscribe, again, you're supporting the growth of this channel, and I really, really appreciate that. And of course, every Friday you'll have a new episode of Decode. Thank you so much for watching.